I really love newspaper comic strip characters. On mornings where my dad would take me to school when I was a kid, we'd enjoy breakfast at Bagel Stop, he'd parse out the funnies from his morning paper and let me have them, and after I read them, instead of throwing them away, I'd hoard them in my room to relive later. Comic strips feel like such a respite of an art form because as a medium they can establish characters in just a few panels. Not by telling some grand story, but with expression and personality. To properly get a joke, you have to understand a character, their circumstance, and where they're coming from. And I think there's sort of a beautiful art to how slapdash newspaper comics often have to establish all of that, and how the very best of them pride themselves on that skill. Everyone has their favorite funny strips, Pearls Before Swine, Calvin and Hobbes, Kathy, but undoubtedly the most famous of them all is Garfield. Toys, games, movies, clothes, restaurants. There was a time when Garfield rivaled the likes of Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny, and The Simpsons in recognizability. And while that's still the case today, it's for entirely different reasons, as Garfield's popularity has sort of caved in on itself. And the world seems confused as to how and why everyone was so nuts about Garfield in the first place, making him into a popular meme, manifesting the confusion surrounding Garfield's status as such a monolith of media in a myriad of manners. Jim Davis's Garfield strip is as low stakes as they can get, the main character's chief traits being laziness and ennui. He wasn't bitingly satirical, rambunctiously adventurous, or a cunning overcomer of heels and villains. It was rare he left his cozy house, which is why there seems to be so much collective, almost embarrassment that the world ever went so nuts for such a simple fixture. That said, I'm certainly not one to talk if my relationship with newspaper comics I've divulged is any indicator. I think people, myself included, love Garfield so much because he's a distinctly relaxed character. He was never meant to be followed for bombastic journeys or anything. He's a cat who relaxes at home while you're at work, and I think reading Garfield with your coffee first thing in the morning, knowing he's waiting for John while he and you go to work is comforting. And having a Garfield plush, or 2 or 50, no judgment, is similarly nice. I'd argue that what we're memeing nowadays isn't Garfield as a concept, but the way he's misused, as the worst of Garfield's media sees him attend to massive expeditions and save the day, which fundamentally misunderstands his character. If Garfield is an active enough protagonist to participate in all of this, he isn't really Garfield anymore. So does it just break the premise of Garfield to follow him in a story any longer than that taken up by a single comic strip? I don't think that's true, and the perfect model that proves that existed in the Garfield TV specials of the 1980s. There was a handful of these, starring Garfield before he even got his start in Garfield and Friends, his big TV limelight. And many of these specials focused on holidays, which have become mainstays in my own seasonal rotation. Of course, the most popular comic strip character in America would need a voice, a strenuous query considering how much was riding on the first animated depiction of such a famous character, one that would be answered by Lorenzo Music.
Garfield is the voice of Lorenzo Music, whose face I have never seen.
Aren't we? Don't we look just precious in our dumb widow doggy coat?
Cartoon characters live and die by their voice, and I imagine, with all of the pressure surrounding who could ever be the voice of Garfield, a lot of people were trying really hard to make their exaggerated caricature of a fat tabby the one that would be immortalized as Garfield's voice. And yet it went to someone using their natural speaking voice.
Don't blame John. Snappy repartee does not come easily to a dip.
Lorenzo's voice is just so appealing in the first place that his casual tone is what imprinted on Garfield, and I think this is nothing short of a miracle choice. Cartoon's voice is so central to their appeal, if Garfield's voice was done by anyone trying to play an angle or exaggerate something, equally so his adventures would be blown out of proportion. Lorenzo Music's take on Garfield had a ton of personality, but it was all understated and so charmingly. There was no need for Garfield's voice to be huge because neither were his stories.
That I understand this cat, and I am this cat.
The Garfield specials often feel less like overarching stories and more like thematically connected, well, comic strips. Just the smaller scaled chronicle of Garfield enjoying Halloween, Christmas, and so on. They were coherent stories, but it's rarely a character's action that drives one along, just their reactions to the antics and matters at hand. These specials are a modest 30 minutes after all, and I think they made the correct call, more or less animating the strip that lightly held them together with a low-stakes story rather than forcing Garfield into an overarching narrative he doesn't belong in. We see Garfield weighing himself on Thanksgiving, picking out a costume for Halloween, and dreading family meetings for Christmas in just these small, pleasant little moments. My favorite scene of any of these specials is that of Garfield resting on Grandma Arbuckle's lap on Christmas Eve. The two take a surprisingly solemn break from the hijinks of the rest of the family and talk about their love of Christmas and the vulnerability that comes with it.
Since Grandpa passed on, I've whiled away many a lonely hour rocking and stroking my cats.
I envy those cats.
Men like him didn't feel like they could show much affection outwardly, but on Christmas, it was okay.
It's not just that it's a beautiful sequence on its own, with the heart-wrenching writing or Pat Carroll's wonderful performance as Grandma, but it's a perfect distillation of this take on Garfield's animation, balancing humor with sensitivity while never doing so at the expense of Garfield's cozy homebody spirit. Outside the gags and stories, however short, what made the substance of these specials was their music.
If every night was a night to go trick or treat. Trick or treat.
Music was never a big element of the Garfield comics. In fact, I'm sure the heavy implementation of musical numbers in the Garfield specials was simply out of recognition that, well, most cartoon specials have songs. But song serendipitously suits Garfield like a glove because it's an entertaining way to look into a character without forcing that character to move the story past their own capacity. You can stay in one place and dwell on an emotional beat, but in a way that's still enthralling and enriches your familiarity with the characters. Garfield's emotional arcs don't need to be proven by some grand adventure because it's beautifully set to music by music. Well, yes, but I mean literally, music. Music that is largely the magic work of Ms. Desiree Goyette, who very frequently collaborated with Phil Roman and Bill Melendez on their Peanuts work. A big thing I love about Peanuts is how the somber jazz suits Charlie Brown's reflective, sometimes depressive personality, and considering the Peanuts had a vignette-formed, character-driven narrative born of its comic strip origins just like Garfield, Goyette's Venn diagram of experience couldn't have been better. Goyette applies a mentality of jazz to Garfield as well, but much more optimistic in tone. This means the interpretive, spontaneous feel of jazz could still perfectly weave in and out of the contrasting story threads, but in a way that was distinct and suited Garfield's character. Goyette had such a masterful grasp on Garfield's personality that she danced in front of a camera in character as the lasagna-loving cat for animators to trace for one of the special's opening numbers.
Look out, 'cause here comes Garfield. He's always got to be one up on ya, and he'll beat you to the punch every time.
Bear in mind that these songs are the portal into Garfield past his facade of apathy, meaning we owe way more to Desiree than I initially thought to the childlike charm of Garfield.
Yeah, and all of that, but the one thing I'm not is a scaredy cat. Some non-stop shopping to work up an appetite.
Dad would chop down the tree.
Chores.
Mom would fix up the meal.
Work.
The magic of Garfield wasn't that he was an overbearing hero who overcame great odds, or even a particularly sympathetic everyman. Every bit of his character revolves back to how understated he is. That's what makes it so satisfying when he does come around to show great enthusiasm and even love. You know he means it in a way that's oddly human, thanks in no small part to his voice work by Lorenzo Music, and it's the freeform spirit of jazz that lets him express these emotions in an abstract and entertaining way, thanks to the brilliance of Desiree Goyette. Whoever handles Garfield next, I hope will remember that spirit. I hope to return to a Garfield I can imagine monopolizing my bedroom while waiting for me to return home from work sooner than later.
I mean, there are moments when you just think, what am I doing working for this obnoxious character? He must be a bad influence on people. But what he does is make us laugh at our own feelings.